The bright London sun shone down on Buckingham Palace, a rare and cherished occurrence that had drawn throngs of tourists to its gates. The grandeur of the palace loomed, its timeless elegance captivating visitors from every corner of the globe. Amidst the crowd stood Mark, a middle-aged tourist from Florida, his loud floral shirt and mismatched cargo shorts a glaring testament to his indifference to blending in. Mark was not a man to be impressed by tradition or restrained by decorum. To him, the stoic royal guards were not symbols of British history and discipline, but an amusing curiosity, a quirky backdrop for his social media feed. The scene was ripe for his entertainment, and Mark intended to make the most of it. As he positioned himself near the ceremonial rope, the rhythmic clatter of the guards' boots echoed through the courtyard. Their movements were precise, their posture impeccable. Each guard seemed to embody centuries of tradition, their unflinching gazes fixed straight ahead. Yet Mark's attention wasn't on the ceremony itself. It was on how he could exploit the situation for laughs. He began by taking rapid photos, adjusting his phone at absurd angles to capture exaggerated close-ups. Mark zoomed in on a guard's hat, chuckling at the towering black bearskin that seemed almost comical to him. The crowd around him murmured softly, a mix of admiration for the ceremony and quiet disapproval for Mark's antics. Not content with mere photography, Mark decided to test the limits of the guard's composure. He leaned over the barrier, waving his hand theatrically to see if he could provoke a reaction. When that failed, he resorted to exaggerated gestures, mimicking the guard's rigid stance in a mocking parody. Some tourists nearby stifled their laughter, their discomfort masked by the humor of the moment. The guards remained unmoved, their discipline unshaken. Yet to Mark, their stoicism only encouraged him. It wasn't just about having fun anymore. It was about breaking through the impenetrable wall of their professionalism. The crowd's shifting energy seemed to go unnoticed by him as he continued his one-man show. Mark's behavior escalated when he picked up a coin from the ground and flicked it, aiming for the feet of one of the guards. The small clink of metal on stone barely registered over the murmurs of the crowd, but a few people gasped audibly. A young boy, holding his mother's hand, asked a hushed question about the guards, his innocent curiosity contrasting sharply with Mark's growing disrespect. As if feeding off the unease of the onlookers, Mark turned to the crowd and grinned. He made a theatrical bow, arms wide as though inviting applause. The crowd's response was muted, their expressions ranging from mild amusement to outright discomfort. A few people began to whisper among themselves, their words carried away by the gentle breeze. A young woman standing nearby frowned deeply, her camera lowered as she exchanged a glance with her companion. She muttered something under her breath, loud enough for those around her to hear, but not directed at Mark. Her companion nodded in agreement, their collective disapproval forming an invisible line between themselves and Mark's antics. Unfazed by the mounting tension, Mark scanned the lineup of guards, his eyes settling on a younger soldier stationed at the far end. The guard's clean-shaven face and slightly nervous posture made him an easy target in Mark's eyes. Emboldened, Mark sauntered over, his swagger unmistakable. The crowd, sensing another escalation, shifted uncomfortably. As Mark leaned closer to the younger guard, his phone inches from the soldier's face, the atmosphere grew tense. Tourists who had previously been content to spectate now exchanged concerned glances. A few moved away, their quiet withdrawal a silent protest against Mark's behavior. The younger guard remained steadfast, his eyes fixed ahead, his jaw tight with the effort of maintaining his composure. Mark, oblivious to the strain he was causing, snapped a photo so close it caught the faint reflection of the palace in the guard's polished buttons. The audacity of the act left the surrounding tourists visibly unsettled. At last, a uniformed staff member stationed nearby approached. Her presence alone carried authority, her expression firm but professional as she stepped toward Mark. The crowd seemed to exhale collectively, their silent hope for intervention finally realized. Mark's bravado faltered for a moment as he noticed her, but he quickly masked it with a cocky grin. The staff member's reprimand was measured and polite, her tone unwavering. Though her words were not loud, they carried an air of finality that left no room for argument. She gestured toward the barrier, reminding Mark of the line he had crossed. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their approval of her intervention clear. Mark raised his hands in mock surrender, his grin widening as he stepped back theatrically. He muttered something dismissive, loud enough for those around him to hear but not directed at anyone in particular. His tone was one of feigned innocence, as though he had been unfairly chastised for simply having a bit of fun. The staff member's gaze didn't waver, her silence a firm reminder of her authority. She stood her ground, her posture as resolute as the guards themselves. After a long moment, Mark shrugged and turned away, his demeanor unshaken but his antics temporarily paused. The crowd's disapproval lingered, a palpable tension that seemed to hang in the air, even as the ceremony continued. As Mark retreated to the edges of the crowd, he noticed the stares directed at him. Some were hostile, others merely curious, but all shared a common undercurrent of judgment. For the first time that morning, Mark seemed to register the weight of his actions. His grin faltered briefly, replaced by a fleeting look of uncertainty, yet it wasn't enough to dampen his sense of entitlement. The ceremony carried on, the guards' disciplined movements unbroken by the spectacle that had played out before them. But for the tourists who had witnessed Mark's behavior, the memory of his disrespect lingered. The contrast between the solemnity of the guards and the brashness of one man served as a stark reminder of the delicate balance between curiosity and decorum. Mark, now standing at a distance, reviewed the photos on his phone. Each image seemed to mock the very tradition it sought to capture, a collection of moments stripped of their dignity. He chuckled to himself, satisfied with his morning's work. But as he glanced back at the palace, the grandeur of its facade seemed to loom larger, its silent presence a rebuke he couldn't quite ignore. The first act of Mark's day at Buckingham Palace had come to a close, leaving behind a trail of discomfort and disapproval. Yet for all his bravado, the cracks in his confidence hinted at the possibility that even he couldn't completely escape the weight of his actions. The sun had risen higher in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the palace grounds. The tourists remained at a distance, their eyes alternating between the royal guards and Mark, whose antics had not gone unnoticed. Though he had momentarily stepped back, the disruption he had caused still lingered in the air. Whispers of judgment rippled through the crowd like waves, and Mark, despite his earlier bravado, felt a subtle discomfort creeping up on him. It wasn't the reprimand that bothered him. He was used to brushing off authority, but the cold stares that now met him from all directions. For the first time that morning, the laughter he had hoped for seemed distant, swallowed by the unease around him. Mark tried to shake off the feeling. He took a few steps away from the guards, casually pulling out his phone again to scan through the photos he'd taken. He examined the images with a smug grin, appreciating the way the guards' stern expressions seemed even more comical through the lens. The photos were perfect for his social media, sure to rack up likes and laughs, but something gnawed at him. The quiet judgment of the people around him had begun to sink in, and it made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite put his finger on. He glanced back at the guards, noting how they stood unwavering and unyielding. They were a symbol of something Mark could never quite grasp, the steadfast commitment to tradition, duty, and respect. It was all very British, he thought, almost too proper. Yet in his mind, it was that very seriousness that made it ripe for ridicule. Mark had always believed that nothing should be taken too seriously, that life was better when you were having fun, poking fun, and not letting anything get in the way of a good time. But the crowds, the murmurs, the disapproving glances from tourists, these were new. They felt foreign. He had been the center of attention before, but never in such an uncomfortable way. Still, Mark wasn't about to back down. He had his reputation to uphold, his audience to entertain. Besides, there was no harm in a little fun, right? A new wave of tourists had arrived, drawn by the promise of witnessing the famed changing of the guard ceremony. The fresh batch of faces seemed oblivious to the events that had unfolded earlier. They were eager, wide-eyed, taking in the history before them. Mark saw this as his chance to redeem himself, to return to the spotlight with a fresh burst of energy. With exaggerated enthusiasm, Mark moved closer to the front of the crowd, weaving through groups of people as he went. He decided to put on an impromptu performance, something to get everyone laughing again, to make sure they wouldn't remember his earlier misstep. He cracked a few jokes with the people around him, flexing his ability to lighten the mood. The tourists around him chuckled, momentarily distracted from the guards and their disciplined routine. Mark's bravado returned, his earlier discomfort fading into the background. But then, as he caught the eye of the young guard who had been his target earlier, something shifted. The guard's gaze never wavered, his posture as rigid as ever. Mark found himself locking eyes with the soldier for a brief moment, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between them. It was as if the guard was silently daring him, challenging him to cross another line. Mark didn't flinch. He was a man of action, not words, and if the guard was up for it, so was he. Without a second thought, Mark sidestepped to the edge of the ceremonial rope and inched toward the guard, his steps slow and deliberate. The atmosphere seemed to tighten around him as the crowd sensed his intentions. For a fleeting moment, Mark considered the consequences of his actions. He had already tested the guard's patience once, and now he was about to do it again. Was it worth it? In a split second, Mark snapped a photo right in front of the guard's face, just inches away. The camera flash blinked harshly in the soldier's eyes, a stark contrast to his calm, emotionless face. The crowd gasped. Some shook their heads, while others murmured in disbelief. A few tourists began to murmur softly, their voices filled with concern for the soldier, who had not moved an inch. The young boy from earlier, who had been holding his mother's hand, looked up at his mother in confusion, no longer interested in the guards, but instead watching Mark's behavior with wide eyes. But Mark wasn't done. He stepped even closer, his phone hovering just above the guard's polished buttons, aiming for the perfect shot. The guard's eyes remained fixed forward, but Mark could see his jaw tightening, the only indication of the strain he was enduring. The air between them seemed thick with unspoken tension, and for the briefest moment, Mark questioned whether this was truly funny anymore. But then, just as quickly, the thought passed. He was determined to break through the guard's stoicism, to get a reaction. He leaned in, whispering loudly enough for those around him to hear. "Come on, you're not gonna crack, are you?" The challenge hung in the air, daring the soldier to respond, to show even the faintest sign of human emotion. The guard did not respond. His professionalism remained unwavering. At that moment, the uniformed staff member reappeared, a sharp presence in the crowd once again. Mark could see her walking toward him with purpose, her posture firm and her gaze fixed. This time, she was not alone. Another staff member had joined her, and together they approached with an air of authority that Mark could not ignore. His heart skipped skipped a beat, and his cocky grin faltered for just a moment. The crowd parted slightly, allowing the staff members to move forward without obstruction. Mark's bravado evaporated, and for the first time, he felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The woman in charge approached him with a measured calmness, her voice firm as she addressed him. "Sir, you are not permitted to interfere with the ceremony or the guards in any way. You need to step back immediately." Mark opened his mouth to protest, but the word stuck in his throat. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him now, a collective weight of disapproval that he couldn't escape. A few people had begun to point their fingers, whispering among themselves about his behavior. His earlier sense of confidence had all but dissipated. He glanced at the young guard once more, who had not moved an inch, and the realization hit him hard. This wasn't just about having fun or getting attention. It was about respect, the kind of respect that Mark had, until now, taken for granted. The staff member's gaze was unyielding. "Step back or I'll have to ask you to leave." For a long moment, Mark stood still, his chest tight, his mind racing. It felt as though the entire courtyard was waiting for his next move. The crowd's judgment weighed heavily on him, but there was nowhere to hide. He looked at the guard one last time, then back at the staff member. Slowly, reluctantly, he nodded. "Fine, I'm going." Mark stepped back, his shoulders slumping slightly. The crowd watched him as he retreated to the edges, where he stood in silence, his phone still clutched tightly in his hand. The staff members turned their attention back to the ceremony, and the guards resumed their precise movements, undeterred by the scene that had unfolded before them. Mark had lost the moment, and for the first time that day, he wasn't sure if he had won anything at all. As Mark retreated further into the crowd, a strange silence enveloped him. The lively chatter and laughter from earlier seemed distant now, muted by the heavy, almost tangible discomfort that hung in the air. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his phone still clutched in his hand, but the thrill of snapping photos had faded. He glanced over at the young guard, still standing tall and unwavering, and felt a pang of something unfamiliar. Was it guilt? No, it couldn't be. Guilt was a feeling for people who made mistakes, who regretted their actions. He didn't regret anything, did he? Mark shook his head, trying to push the thought aside. His eyes flickered to the other tourists, some of whom had returned their attention to the ceremony while others still stole glances at him. He caught the eye of the young boy from earlier, who had stopped staring at the guards and now looked at Mark with something akin to confusion. The boy's innocent curiosity seemed to contrast sharply with Mark's behavior, and for a brief moment, Mark felt exposed, like his actions had left a mark on the boy's perception of the world, a seed of cynicism planted where there had once been only wonder. But Mark quickly brushed the thought aside. He had never been one to dwell on the feelings of others, especially not strangers. He was here for himself, here for the laughs, here to make a name for himself. He had made his mark on the ceremony, hadn't he? It wasn't his fault if the crowd didn't appreciate his sense of humor. They probably couldn't handle a little fun anyway. Yet as the ceremony drew to a close, with the guards marching off with military precision, the crowd slowly began to disperse, and Mark found himself lingering behind. The staff members who had intervened continued to watch the remaining tourists, their stern presence a reminder that the peace had been restored. Mark stood there, feeling strangely out of place. For the first time in a long while, he felt like an outsider, like he didn't belong in the atmosphere of reverence that surrounded him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from his friend back in Florida. Mark glanced at it, but as his eyes skimmed over the text, he didn't feel the rush of excitement he normally did when he received a notification. He had been expecting validation, maybe a funny comment or a compliment on his latest post, but all he saw was a question. "How's the trip going? Hope you're having fun at the palace." Mark's thumb hovered over the screen. He had been so focused on making the moment his own, on capturing the perfect shot, that he hadn't even considered sharing the real experience. He hadn't even thought to mention the guards, his original, now half-forgotten goal for the day. All he had was the aftermath of his antics, an empty gallery of photos that felt less like triumph and more like a hollow collection of moments stripped of meaning. Sighing, Mark pocketed the phone again. He turned around to face Buckingham Palace, its stone facade now bathed in the soft light of the late morning. The grandeur of the building, the history embedded in its walls, seemed to mock him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something deeper than the likes and shares he had been so eager to accumulate. The sound of footsteps behind him caught his attention, and he turned to see a couple walking by, their laughter light and carefree. They were clearly enjoying the visit, absorbed in the spectacle of the guards' march, their cameras snapping away in time with the rhythm of the ceremony. Mark watched them for a moment, envy creeping into his chest. They seemed so effortlessly content, so at peace with the moment. There was no rushing to capture everything, no need to make everything about the performance. They were simply present, savoring the experience in a way that Mark hadn't. His eyes drifted once more to the younger guard, now standing in a new position, a quiet sentinel sentinel who seemed unbothered by the passing tourists, Mark found himself wondering what it was like to be in the guard's shoes, to embody a tradition so steadfast, so unmoving. How did it feel to stand there, unmoved by the distractions of the world around you? Did the guard ever get tired of it? Did he ever wonder what life would be like beyond the gates of the palace? Mark didn't have an answer, but he suddenly felt an odd sense of respect for the young man. It wasn't just the unwavering professionalism he admired, it was the stillness, the ability to remain grounded despite the chaos around him. In that moment, Mark realized how much he had been chasing after the wrong things: validation, attention, and amusement, without ever taking the time to appreciate the quiet moments that truly mattered. The crowd had dispersed now, and the palace grounds seemed less crowded. The air felt lighter, as if the tension of Mark's earlier antics had lifted. He was left alone in the shadow of the grand building, a man lost in the quiet reflection of his own actions. He glanced around one last time, then turned to leave, his steps slow and contemplative. As Mark made his way out of the courtyard, the sounds of the city began to flood back in. Distant traffic, the murmur of voices, the occasional honk of a taxi. The pulse of London's vibrant energy returned, but it felt different now. Mark no longer felt like he was in control of the narrative, no longer the center of attention. He had faded into the background, just another face in the crowd. He walked down the steps, past the well-dressed tourists snapping photos of the palace and the guards, the gentle hum of life resuming its normal rhythm. For the first time that day, Mark wasn't concerned with his phone or the next joke or photo op. Instead, he found himself wondering if there was more to life than the constant chase for approval. Mark's steps slowed as he reached the entrance gate, the bustling world around him feeling distant. He stopped for a moment, gazing at the intricate design of the wrought iron fence, the careful craftsmanship that had stood the test of time. In a small, almost imperceptible way, he felt humbled by the palace's quiet strength. The guards, the traditions, and the tourists, it was all part of something larger than himself. As he finally passed through the gate, Mark found himself thinking of his next destination, but the usual excitement wasn't there. The photo ops, the jokes, the clicks of his phone, they all seemed trivial now. Mark had learned something today, something that couldn't be captured in a photo or shared on social media. Sometimes, the greatest moments weren't the ones you forced into the frame, but the ones you let pass quietly by, unnoticed and uncelebrated. With a deep breath, Mark took his first step into the bustling streets of London. His phone buzzed again, but this time he didn't reach for it. The noise of the city surrounded him, but in that moment he was finally at peace.